Okay, in this lesson now we're going to look at how natural selection works. I told you in the last video that we would start with the mechanism for natural selection. Okay, so this is what Darwin said. Darwin proposed what he called descent with modification, and that later became natural selection. And the crux of what he said is right here. Okay, he said that organisms are born the way that they're born, okay? And either they have favorable adaptations that help them to survive, and if they survive better, then they reproduce more often. And if they reproduce more often, they pass those favorable traits on, and then their descendants with those favorable traits start to take over the population and outnumber everybody else. Over time, that gene that gave the individual that adaptation spreads through the population. But the idea here is that the individual doesn't change, the whole species changes. So what Darwin would say about giraffes is that maybe one or two giraffes were born with a slightly longer neck. That gave them an adaptive advantage, right? So they have this adaptation that allows them to survive better because maybe they ate better, which meant they were stronger, healthier, better able to evade predators, able to reproduce more often then because they lived longer, and they passed that on. Now, he didn't necessarily know about genes. We now know that that is the result of genes. So that's kind of how natural selection works. The next thing to do is look at the ways that natural selection can move, and the first way is looking at stabilizing selection. So with stabilizing selection, we'll start with just a little graph down here. With stabilizing selection, if this is the graph that you're seeing is the original population, in stabilizing selection, what happens is the individuals in the middle of the phenotypes get selected for. Okay, so what you have is your bell curve gets even higher in the middle and lower on the other ends. Okay, so let's look at an example of that. So here what we've got is a population of butterflies, and they have a range of phenotypes here. And what's happening is, for some reason, the ones in the middle of color are surviving better than the dark blue or the really, really light to white butterflies. So there's some reason why the ones that are in the mid-range of phenotypes are surviving, which means these guys are going to increase in population size. The others are going to decrease, and what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a hump that looks kind of like this. And that's stabilizing selection. In disruptive selection, what you have is here's our original population. For some reason, the mid-range is selected against in stabilizing selection. So what happens is both the very, very light and the very, very dark, in this case the butterflies, so the really dark butterflies survive better and the very light butterflies survive better, but the ones in the middle drop off. That's disruptive selection. And finally, the last way that natural selection can move is via directional selection. So if the red graph is our original population, and this time we're looking at mice and their fur color, if for some reason only one extreme phenotype is favored, like these very dark mice get favored, maybe they have better camouflage or something like that, what happens is the graph shifts over, okay, to one direction. Now in directional selection it could go this way, it could also go the other way. It doesn't really matter, it just moves in one direction or the other. But natural selection can move in any of these three ways, either through stabilizing, disruptive, or directional selection. All right, now let's look at species, because all of this is about making a species, right? That's what ultimately happens. Evolution changes organisms and creates new species. So first, let's look at what the biological species definition is. The biological species definition says that organisms are part of the same species if they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Now, humans are all humans because no matter which two humans you pluck from anywhere on the globe, they could mate and produce a baby that could grow up and have its own babies one day. That's different from, say, a human and a chimpanzee, or lions and tigers. You could mate a lion and a tiger together, but the baby that they produce would be sterile and not fertile. So when that baby liger grew up, it wouldn't be able to have its own babies. So that's why lions and tigers are different species. That's why humans are the same species. In order to make a species, you need two things. The first of these is isolation. Okay, so let's look at isolation, and let's come down here to isolation. There are two ways that you can isolate organisms. The first would be a physical isolation, some sort of physical barrier. This is called geographic isolation. So, for example, if you had a forest and there were a bunch of squirrels living in the forest, and you built a 6-lane highway right through the middle of that forest, and now the squirrels on both sides of the highway can't reach each other anymore. They are physically isolated from one another. The second thing, the second way that you can isolate is behaviorally isolating. So if, for example, an animal or a group of animals are hand-raised by humans, they don't learn the proper courtship rituals to be able to mate with individuals of their own kind. So that would be something that's an example of behavioral isolation. All right, so there's two ways that you can get isolation, either physical or behavioral. The second thing that you need, though, is evolution in different directions. So you need these isolated groups of individuals to start evolving in different directions, and when they evolve in different directions, eventually they get to where they can no longer interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So that's how you make a species. You got to isolate, and then you got to bring them in different directions. Now, in terms of how fast this happens, what Darwin said was gradualism. He said that species changed slowly and steadily over time, and this is what you're seeing on the left-hand side. The butterfly starts like this, and what you get are slow, gradual changes over time that eventually result in these two different kinds of butterflies. Okay. What we now know is that Darwin was wrong. What actually happens is something called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium happens because you get a quick change. Okay. There's a genetic mutation. This butterfly all of a sudden now looks like this. This one all of a sudden looks like that. It's not a slow, gradual change where this one gets slowly lighter, this one gets slowly more brown from this color. It's a quick change, okay? And that's because mutation is fueling these changes. So punctuated equilibrium is the model that we go with. The thing to keep in mind here is that natural selection is working on phenotypes. Okay, it's selecting, the environment is selecting for or against different phenotypes or characteristics that organisms possess to change the genes in a population over time. Okay, and that's the key. Because we're selecting phenotypes, what's ultimately happening is we're monkeying around with the frequencies of the different genes in the population. In other words, the percentages of the genes in the population. Remember, natural selection does not work on individuals. Individuals are born the way that they are. They either survive or they don't. Okay? Now, there's a very important little equation that you have to know here, and it is P plus Q equals 1 or 100%. And all this is saying is that the frequency of P, which is the frequency of the dominant allele, plus the frequency of Q, which is the frequency of the recessive allele, has to equal 1 or 100%. Okay? It's really simple. If P, the frequency of the dominant allele, is 65%, then that means Q, the frequency of the recessive allele, must be 35%. That's all it's saying, okay? Because you have to equal 100%. Same thing, if Q is 0.25, then P has to be 0.75, okay, to get them to equal 1, okay? So whether you're talking about percentages or decimals here, it really doesn't matter. P is the frequency of the dominant, Q is the frequency of the recessive. To get changes in these frequencies, you have to get selecting mechanisms. Okay, so you have to get things like mutations, You have to get changes in the environment, stuff like that. You also, though, cannot have any net immigration and emigration. So when organisms move, you can't have genes moving in and out of the population. Well, you can, and that's going to dramatically influence frequencies. The other thing is catastrophic events. Things that drastically reduce the gene pool will cause a change in these frequencies P and Q. This is called genetic drift when it happens. So if you have a small population of, say, 100 individuals and 50 of them get wiped out because of a forest fire, then half your population is gone. As opposed to if you had, say 500 individuals and 50 are wiped out. You have the same number wiped out, but the percentage is less because you had 500 to begin with instead of 100. So those catastrophic events are more dangerous in small populations than large populations. All right, last thing. There are a couple other variations that you can see here. The first is artificial selection, and here's a little picture of what artificial selection looks like. Artificial selection is when humans select traits because we find them helpful, not because they help the individual survive in nature. And I know we've had this discussion before, but all dogs come from wolf stock, right? The original organism that gave rise to human dog, or the dogs that we use as pets, were wolves. Okay, and through selective breeding, humans have bred them to do different jobs for us. Okay, but those characteristics that we see in our favorite dog breeds are not necessarily going to help them to survive in nature. And that's why we call this artificial selection, because nature is not doing the selecting. There is one other variation, and you guys are going to watch a little video on it, and this is called sexual selection. Sexual selection happens when traits persist in spite of appearing to be maladaptive in an environment. So, for example, Darwin once said the sight of a peacock makes him sick because when he saw a peacock, he saw a bird that's very colorful. It's got a tail that keeps it from flying. It can't really camouflage and hide very well, and he couldn't understand why would that tail persist in nature. Well, it turns out it persists in nature because female peahens found it attractive. So if you were a male with a very big, bright, bushy tail, you were attractive to females and you had more opportunities for mating than if you had kind of a drab, small tail. So sexual selection can cause traits to persist that wouldn't normally look like they should persist in populations. All right, so that's a quick rundown on all the stuff you need to know about mechanisms for how natural selection works.